The year was 2347, and humanity had finally earned its place among the stars. For 40 years, humans had fought alongside the 5 elder species of the Galactic Coalition. They had bled on alien worlds. They had died protecting civilizations that were not their own. They had proven themselves as fierce warriors and brilliant tacticians. And now, standing on the bridge of the UES Vengeance, Admiral Daniel Carson believed that humanity had finally found its family among the stars. The Dominion was coming. Every sensor on every ship screamed warnings as the massive enemy fleet approached the. There were conquerors who consumed entire civilizations without mercy. They had destroyed dozens of species across the galaxy, and now they had turned their hungry eyes toward Coalition space. Admiral Carson watched the enemy ships fill his. There were thousands of them, dark and angular, bristling with weapons that could crack planets. But he was not afraid. The Coalition had assembled the greatest fleet in galactic history to stop them. Human ships stood ready alongside the vessels of their allies. The had all sent their finest warriors to this battle. Commander Lisa Morgan stood at the tactical station, her fingers moving across holographic displays as she coordinated fleet formations. She was 34 years old, born on Mars, and she had spent her entire adult life serving in the fleet. She believed in the Coalition. She believed in the alliance that humanity had worked so hard to build. Lieutenant Brooks monitored communications from the Allied fleets. He was young and eager, with a quick smile that made him popular among the crew. His job was to keep the human ships connected with their and allies, who were supposed to flank the enemy when the battle began. The plan was simple. Human ships would hold the center and draw this attention. The Allied fleets would sweep in from the sides and catch the enemy in a devastating crossfire. It was a good plan. Admiral Carson had helped design it himself. But as they drew closer, something strange happened. The Allied fleets did not move. Brooks checked his instruments again and again, but the and ships remained stationary. They were not advancing to their flanking positions. They were not responding to communications. Admiral Carson felt the first cold touch of doubt in his chest. He ordered Brooks to contact the Coalition Command Center on Prime. The response came not from a military officer, but from High Chancellor Oz himself, the leader of the Council and the head of the entire Galactic Coalition. The alien's face appeared on the main. His expression showed no emotion as he spoke words that would echo through human history forever. He said that humanity had served its purpose. He said that human aggression had drawn this attention away from Coalition worlds for long enough. He said that the Coalition had negotiated new terms with the Dominion. Earth and all human colonies would be given to thee in exchange for lasting peace. Admiral Carson could not believe what he was hearing. He demanded clarification. He demanded to know if this was some kind of mistake or cruel joke, but Oz simply confirmed the truth. Every Coalition species had signed the agreement. The had all agreed to sacrifice humanity for their own survival. The transmission ended, and in that moment of stunned silence, the trap was sprung. They did not attack the Coalition fleet. They had no need to. Instead, their ships broke into dozens of smaller groups and jumped away in all directions. Admiral Carson realized with horror that they were not here to fight. They were here to begin the harvest. Reports flooded in from across human space. Ships were appearing over Earth. They were striking Mars and Luna and the orbital stations. They were hitting every human colony across 12 star systems simultaneously. The attack had been coordinated with precision that should have been impossible. Then Carson understood the full depth of the betrayal. The Coalition had not simply abandoned humanity. They had actively helped to plan this massacre. They had provided defense codes and patrol schedules. They had given the enemy the locations of civilian population centers. They had made sure that humanity would have no chance to fight back. On the Earth began to burn. Orbital bombardment turned cities into craters of molten glass. Billions of people died in the first hour. Children and families and everything humanity had built over thousands of years was erased in fire that could be seen from space. Admiral Carson stood frozen as he watched his die. The man who had led humanity's fleet for 15 years could not speak or move. His mind simply could not accept what was happening. Commander Morgan was different. Where Carson saw only despair, she saw necessity. The fleet was already taking casualties as ships returned to finish off the human military. They had minutes, maybe less, before complete destruction. She grabbed Admiral Carson's arm and shouted for him to give orders. When he could not respond, she made the decision herself. She took command and ordered every surviving human ship to break formation and run. There was no time for careful planning. There was only survival. 47 ships answered her call out of an original fleet of 300. The rest were already dead or dying. Morgan transmitted coordinates to all surviving vessels and ordered an immediate jump. The destination was a place known only to humanity's oldest military archives, a secret that no alien had ever learned. The ghost yards had been abandoned for over a century. They were shipyards from humanity's first interstellar wars, hidden in the dark space between stars. Morgan had studied them as a cadet, fascinated by the history of human expansion. Now that knowledge would save what remained of her species. Admiral Carson's flagship was destroyed moments before the jump, struck by a warship that had targeted the command vessel. Carson died, never knowing whether any humans would survive the day. But Morgan's ship made it. So did 46 others, carrying 30,000 survivors, both military and civilian. They vanished into the dark between stars, leaving behind a galaxy that celebrated their extinction. The coalition declared victory. They were satisfied with their prize. Peace returned to the elder species, and they quickly forgot about the young race they had sacrificed. Humanity became a footnote in diplomatic history, a regrettable necessity for the greater good. No one noticed that humanity had not been completely destroyed. No one imagined that the survivors were already planning their return, and no one understood the terrible mistake they had made by leaving even a handful of humans alive. In the cold silence of the ghost yards, Commander Lisa Morgan looked at the scared and broken people around her. She had no words of comfort. She had no promises of safety. She had only one thing to offer them. She told them to remember. She told them to remember Earth burning. She told them to remember the faces of the allies who had sold them to monsters. She told them to hold that memory close, because one day they would need it. The galaxy believed humanity was dead. The galaxy was wrong. 5 years passed in silence, and the galaxy moved on without humanity. The Dominion honored their agreement with the Coalition and to their territories. They were satisfied with the billions of humans they had consumed and the rich worlds they had claimed. The elder species prospered in ways they had never imagined possible. Without the burden of war, their economies boomed. Trade flourished between worlds that had once feared invasion. The extinction of humanity was considered a small price for such lasting peace. Historians wrote about the human species with cold detachment. They described humans as useful soldiers who had served their purpose. They noted that human aggression, while valuable in wartime, made them unsuitable for civilized galactic society. Some even argued that the sacrifice had been a kindness, sparing humanity from a future where their violent nature would have led to conflict anyway. No one mourned, no one remembered, the galaxy simply forgot. But in the hidden depths of the ghost yards, the survivors refused to forget. Commander Lisa Morgan had become Admiral Morgan now, though the title felt hollow. She led 30,000 people who had lost everything. They had no future. They had only each other and the burning need to survive. The ghost yards had been abandoned for over a century, but the basic infrastructure remained intact. Ancient shipyard facilities floated in the dark between stars, forgotten relics of humanity's first expansion into space. Morgan put every able body to work restoring these facilities. There was no time for grief. There was only the work that needed to be done. Engineer Cole became her right hand in the rebuilding effort. He was 50 years old, a civilian contractor who had been visiting the fleet when the attack came. His wife and children had been on Earth. He never spoke of them, but the rage in his eyes burned brighter each day. Cole worked 18-hour shifts retrofitting ancient machinery, designing new systems, and solving problems that should have been impossible. Dr. Price led the medical and scientific divisions. She was a geneticist who understood that 30,000 people were not enough to rebuild a species. The genetic diversity was too limited. Without careful planning, humanity would face extinction through inbreeding within a few generations. Price implemented strict breeding protocols and genetic preservation programs. Some people resisted, but Morgan made it clear that personal preferences were secondary to species survival. Lieutenant Brooks had survived the escape, though he had lost his easy smile forever. The young officer who had once joked with his had become something harder and colder. Morgan recognized the change and put it to use. She made Brooks head of intelligence and gave him a simple mission: learn everything about the species that had betrayed them. Brooks established a network of stealth probes throughout Coalition space. These tiny devices were practically invisible, designed to drift through enemy systems and collect information. Over 5 years, Brooks built the most comprehensive intelligence database in galactic history. He knew the locations of every military installation. He knew the names of every political leader. He knew the shipping routes and economic dependencies and critical infrastructure of every species that had signed humanity's death warrant. The Coalition had underestimated humanity from the beginning. They had seen humans as useful soldiers, aggressive and capable but ultimately primitive. They had never bothered to study human history or understand human nature. If they had, they would have known that humans had spent 10,000 years fighting each other before reaching the stars. They would have known that humans had developed patience and cunning through countless wars and betrayals. They would have known that humans never forgot and never forgave. Admiral Morgan understood what Brooks was building. She did not rush him. She knew that revenge without preparation was just suicide by another name. So she waited and watched and planned while her people grew stronger. The shipyards came back to life under Cole's direction. New vessels took shape in the construction bays, each one incorporating lessons learned from the massacre. Human engineers studied captured Coalition technology and weapons salvaged from battlefields. They combined these alien systems with human innovations born of desperation and rage. The ships they built were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. By the end of the 5th year, the human fleet had grown from 47 damaged survivors to 200 warships. They were smaller than Coalition vessels but faster and more heavily armed. Each ship carried weapons designed specifically to exploit the weaknesses that Brooks had identified in enemy defenses. Admiral Morgan named the fleet with careful thought. She did not choose a name meant to intimidate or frighten. She chose a name that described exactly what they intended to do. She called them the Reckoning. On the 5th anniversary of Earth's destruction, Morgan gathered her people in the central hall of the reconstructed yards. 30,000 survivors stood in silence, their faces lit by the glow of display screens showing images of the they had lost. Children born in the yard stood beside veterans who remembered the green hills of Earth and the red deserts of Mars. Morgan spoke to them without emotion. She told them what they already knew. She said that the galaxy believed humanity was dead. She said that the Coalition had moved on and forgotten the crime they had committed. She said that the elder species slept peacefully in their beds, confident that they had eliminated a threat and secured their futures. Then her voice hardened into something like steel. She told her people that the Coalition was wrong. She told them that humanity was not dead. She told them that everything the betrayers had built would be torn down and broken. She told them that the galaxy would learn to fear the dark between stars, because that was where humanity waited. The crowd did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They simply nodded and returned to their work. There was nothing to celebrate yet. The real work was just beginning. Brooks presented his final intelligence report the following day. He had identified the weakest link in the coalition, the species most vulnerable to attack. There were merchants and traders who had contributed nothing to the coalition's military. They had signed humanity's death warrant not out of fear, but out of greed, eager to access markets that had been closed during the war. They hosted the largest financial exchange in the galaxy. 40% of all interstellar commerce flowed through their systems. It was protected by minimal defenses because no one would be foolish enough to attack such a vital economic hub. Admiral Morgan approved the operation. The first strike would hit and demonstrate that humanity had returned, but there would be no warning. There would be no communication. There would only be devastation and silence, the same silence that humanity had endured for 5 years. Captain Samuel was chosen to lead the attack. He was a veteran of the original fleet, a man who had watched his entire family die on Mars. He accepted the mission without hesitation and began preparing his task force immediately. The galaxy had forgotten humanity. The galaxy was about to remember. Morgan watched ships depart for their mission and felt something she had not felt in 5 years. It was not happiness or satisfaction. It was the cold certainty that justice was finally coming for those who had earned it. The long silence was over. The reckoning had begun. Captain Samuel stood on the bridge of the UES Silent Blade and watched Prime grow larger on his. The alien world was covered in massive cities that glittered with lights from pole to pole. Orbital stations circled the planet like jewels on a necklace, each one processing trillions of credits in financial transactions every day. This was the heart of galactic commerce, the center of wealth for 100 civilizations. And it had no idea what was coming. Commanded 12 human warships, each one carrying weapons that the galaxy had never seen. His crew had trained for this mission for months. They knew exactly what to do and exactly how to do it. There would be no hesitation and no mercy. Lieutenant Brooks had spent years studying defense systems. He had identified gaps in their sensor coverage that they themselves did not know existed. Ships exploited these gaps perfectly, dropping out of hyperspace inside the planetary defense perimeter. By the time they detected them, it was already too late. The defense fleet scrambled to respond. 20 warships rushed to intercept the unknown attackers. They were merchant vessels converted for military duty, crewed by traders who had never faced real combat. Against human veterans who had survived the greatest betrayal in galactic history, they had no chance. The battle lasted 9 minutes. Ships moved with deadly precision, their weapons tearing through shields like paper. Every defensive station was destroyed. Every warship was reduced to scattered debris. They had expected to negotiate or surrender. They received neither option. With orbital defenses eliminated, moved to the second phase of the operation. His ships released dozens of devices that fell toward the planet's surface. These were not bombs or missiles. They were something far more devastating. Human engineers had developed electromagnetic pulse weapons capable of burning through electronic systems on a planetary scale. The devices detonated in sequence, sending waves of energy cascading across Prime. Every computer on the planet died. Every financial record vanished. Every piece of digital currency became meaningless noise in corrupted systems. 300 years of accumulated wealth disappeared in an instant. They had built their entire civilization on electronic commerce. Without their systems, they had nothing. They could not trade. They could not communicate. They could not even access their own buildings, which relied on electronic security. The population was unharmed. Not a single citizen died in the attack, But their economy, their pride, and their power had been erased completely. The species that had sold humanity for profit had lost everything they valued. And then Captain did something that terrified the galaxy far more than the attack itself. He left without saying a word. No demands, no claims of responsibility, no threats or warnings. The human ships simply vanished back into the dark between stars as silently as they had arrived. They sent desperate calls for help to the coalition. Ships from other species arrived to investigate. They found a broken world populated by confused and frightened people who could not explain what had happened. The weapon signatures matched no known species. The attack pattern followed no recognized military doctrine. It was as if ghosts had risen from the void to punish the living. Admiral Morgan received report and allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. The first blow had been struck. Now it was time to spread the fear. 3 weeks later, the agricultural world of Seven went dark. This planet produced food for dozens of coalition systems. Its vast farms and processing facilities fed billions of people across the galaxy. It was considered so vital that even they had agreed to leave it untouched during negotiations. The attack was not military, it was biological. Dr. Price had spent years developing a pathogen specifically designed to destroy crops. She had used genetic samples smuggled from research stations, information that Brooks had obtained through his intelligence network. The disease was engineered to spread rapidly through agricultural systems while leaving animal and sentient life completely unharmed. Human agents released the pathogen through the planet's irrigation systems. Within days, crops began dying across every continent. They tried everything they could think of to stop the spread, but the disease was designed to resist their countermeasures. Within a month, Seven's entire agricultural output was destroyed. Famine spread through coalition space. Worlds that had depended on food suddenly faced starvation. Prices for basic supplies skyrocketed. The economic damage from the attack was compounded by a crisis that threatened billions of lives. Again, there was no communication from the attackers. No one claimed responsibility. The coalition could not even confirm that the two attacks were connected. They only knew that something was targeting them with precision and patience that seemed almost supernatural. Panic began to spread through the elder species. Governments increased security around vital installations. Military fleets patrolled their own territories instead of exploring new regions. Trade slowed as merchants became afraid to travel through space that might contain invisible enemies. Admiral Morgan watched the chaos unfold from the ghost yards with cold satisfaction. Brooks provided daily reports on coalition communications, and Morgan studied them carefully. She saw fear growing in messages between governments. She saw accusations and blame being thrown between species that had once been allies. The coalition was beginning to crack. But the attacks had served another purpose beyond economic damage. They had demonstrated human capabilities without revealing human presence. The galaxy knew that someone was hunting them. They did not know who or why or where the enemy might strike next. That uncertainty was its own weapon. The High Council called an emergency meeting to address the crisis. High Chancellor Oss, the same leader who had announced humanity's sacrifice 5 years earlier, demanded answers that no one could provide. His scientists analyzed the weapon signatures and found nothing recognizable. His spies searched for information and found only silence. Some coalition leaders began to suspect the truth. They remembered the species they had sold to They wondered if somehow, impossibly, humans had survived, but they dismissed these fears as paranoia. They had been thorough. Earth had burned. The human fleet had been destroyed. There was no way that such a young and primitive species could have escaped extinction and returned with such terrible power. Morgan knew it was time to end their uncertainty. She had demonstrated what humanity could do. Now she would show them who was doing it. She recorded a message for High Chancellor Oss personally. She used a transmission code that should not have existed, a frequency that Coalition security believed was completely secure. Her face appeared on his private screen, a human face that all records indicated had died 5 years ago at the Battle of Prime. She did not threaten or demand. She simply told him the truth. She said that he knew who she was. She said that he knew what humanity wanted. She told him there would be no negotiation and no peace. She told him that what the Coalition had done to humanity would be returned tenfold. She told him that he would watch everything he had built crumble to dust before she was finished. The transmission ended, and 30 seconds later, the colony of New Threshold lost all communications. When scout ships arrived, they found every piece of technology on the planet disabled. 40 million citizens were alive but helpless, reduced to pre-industrial conditions overnight. The galaxy finally knew who was hunting them. The galaxy finally understood that humanity had returned. And Admiral Morgan smiled for the first time in 5 years, because she knew the real war was just beginning. High Chancellor Oss stared at the blank screen, where Admiral Morgan's face had appeared moments before. His hands trembled as he tried to process what he had just seen. A human. A living, breathing human who should have been dead for 5 years. A human who somehow knew his private communication codes and could reach him anywhere in the galaxy. The reports from New Threshold confirmed his worst fears. 40 million citizens had been rendered helpless in an instant. Not killed, but stripped of everything that made modern life possible. It was a demonstration of power that made the previous attacks seem like warnings. Oss called an emergency session of the Coalition Council. Leaders from every species attended, their holographic images filling the Great Chamber on Prime. The AL High Marshal demanded immediate military action. The Chancellor called for negotiations. The delegation suggested fleeing to the far edges of the galaxy. The representatives, still reeling from their economic collapse, could barely speak at all. The AL were the first to act. They were the military backbone of the Coalition, proud warriors who had stood aside and watched humanity die. Their fleet was the largest in Coalition space, with thousands of warships and millions of soldiers. High Marshal Oss announced that his people would hunt down and destroy this human remnant before it could threaten civilized species any further. Admiral Morgan received intelligence about the AL mobilization within hours. She had expected this response. She had counted on it. The AL were arrogant and overconfident, certain that their numbers would overwhelm any enemy. They had forgotten that numbers meant nothing against an opponent who chose the battlefield. Morgan selected the location for the confrontation with careful thought. The hollow stars were a region of dead systems between Coalition space and what had once been human territory. These ancient suns had burned out millions of years ago, leaving only cold rocks and empty darkness. No one traveled through the hollow stars because there was nothing there worth seeing. Nothing except death waiting in the shadows. Human ships had spent weeks preparing the battlefield. They seeded the region with weapons that Lieutenant Brooks had designed specifically for this engagement. Mines drifted in the void, invisible to standard sensors. Autonomous drones waited in powered-down silence for activation signals. Gravity disruptors were positioned to trap enemy vessels in precisely calculated kill zones. But the most important weapon was something Brooks called the Silence Engine. This device generated a field that disrupted faster-than-light communication and travel. Any ship caught within its range would be unable to call for help or retreat. They would be trapped in the darkness with whatever waited for them there. The AL fleet arrived at the hollow stars with 600 warships. They outnumbered the human forces 3-1. High Marshal Oss commanded from his flagship, confident that this campaign would be remembered as the day the AL saved the galaxy from human vengeance. Admiral Morgan watched the enemy fleet enter the trap from the bridge of the UES Reckoning. Captain commanded the left wing of the human formation. Commander Price, Doctor's younger brother who had risen through the ranks on pure tactical brilliance, led the right wing. Every human ship was crewed by veterans who had lost families and friends to coalition betrayal. The OWL detected the human fleet and moved to engage. Their formations were textbook perfect, designed for the kind of fleet battles they had fought 1,000 times before. They expected the humans to meet them in honorable combat, ship against ship, warrior against warrior. Instead, Morgan activated the silence engine. The effect was immediate and devastating. Every OWL ship lost contact with its allies. Hyperspace drives went offline. Communication systems filled with static. The proud fleet that had entered the hollow stars as a unified force suddenly became 600 isolated vessels, each one blind and deaf and unable to escape. Then the mines began to detonate. Explosions bloomed throughout the OWL formation. Ships that tried to maneuver away from the blasts flew directly into gravity wells that crushed their hulls. Autonomous drones activated and swarmed damaged vessels, tearing through weakened armor with precise strikes. The darkness of the hollow stars became a hell of fire and debris. The human ships moved through the chaos like predators among prey. They targeted engines first, leaving enemy vessels stranded. Then they destroyed weapons systems, leaving the OWL helpless. Only after a ship was completely disabled did they deliver the killing blow. It was not efficient, but it was deliberate. Morgan wanted the OWL to feel fear before they died. High Marshal Oss tried to rally his forces, but without communications, his orders reached no one. He watched his fleet die around him, ship by ship, until only his flagship remained. Human vessels surrounded him, their weapons powered and ready, but they did not fire. Instead, a shuttle launched from the Reckoning and docked with the OWL flagship. Admiral Morgan boarded the enemy vessel with a security team, walking through corridors filled with terrified alien soldiers who made no move to stop her. She found Oss on his bridge, standing alone among the bodies of his officers who had died in the initial attack. The OWL High Marshal was ancient by his species standards, a warrior who had fought in 12 campaigns across the galaxy. He had never known defeat. He had never experienced the helplessness that his enemies felt when facing OWL military might. Now he understood. Morgan stood before him in silence for a long moment. She studied the alien who had commanded the forces that should have defended humanity. She remembered the reports from 5 years ago, the intercepted communications showing that OWL ships had held their positions while humans died. She spoke 3 words to him. She asked if he remembered them now. Then she ordered her security team to space him out the nearest airlock. The battle had lasted 6 hours. The OWL fleet was annihilated to the last ship. Not a single vessel escaped to warn the coalition. Not a single soldier survived to tell tales of human savagery. Morgan ordered 1 OWL shuttle recovered from the debris and repaired. She loaded its computer with a recording of the entire battle and a single message. The message said that 1 species was down and 4 remained. The shuttle was programmed to fly to Prime and deliver its cargo to the Coalition Council. It arrived 3 days later, broadcasting its message on every available frequency. The galaxy watched in horror as the recording played, showing the total destruction of the mightiest military force in Coalition history. High Chancellor Oss understood what this meant. The humans had not simply survived. They had become something far more dangerous than the species the Coalition had sacrificed 5 years ago. They had become vengeance given physical form. The Coalition had created the very thing they feared. They had taken a young and eager species that wanted nothing more than to belong, and they had transformed them into implacable enemies who would never stop until justice was served. Morgan watched the Coalition's reaction through Brooks' intelligence network. She saw the fear spreading through their governments. She saw old alliances fracturing as species blamed each other for the disaster. She saw exactly what she had hoped to see. The first phase of the reckoning was complete. The Coalition knew who was coming for them. They knew that their armies could not stop humanity's return. Now it was time to teach them that nothing could. The coalition fractured within weeks of the Owl massacre. 5 species that had once stood united in betraying humanity now turned on each other like frightened animals. Trust evaporated as each government wondered if their allies might sacrifice them to appease the human threat. The grand alliance that had condemned billions to death collapsed under the weight of its own guilt. They were the first to break. Their chancellor broadcast a message to all human frequencies, offering complete surrender. He promised reparations, formal apologies, and whatever else humanity demanded. He begged for mercy and swore that his people had been pressured into signing the death warrant against their will. Admiral Morgan did not respond. She did not acknowledge the transmission or engage in any communication. She simply ordered Captain to destroy the central government complex with a kinetic bombardment from orbit. The building was reduced to a crater before anyone inside could evacuate. The message was clear. There would be no negotiations. Surrender would not be accepted. They had made their choice 5 years ago, and now they would face the consequences. They tried a different approach. They were a cautious species who had always prioritized survival above all else. When they realized that fighting was hopeless and surrender was impossible, they chose to flee. Their entire civilization abandoned there in a massive exodus, millions of ships carrying billions of people toward the far edge of the galaxy. Morgan tracked their flight through Brooks' sensor network. She waited until they had traveled 3 light years from there, far enough that they believed they had escaped. Then she moved the Reckoning fleet to intercept them. The Armada found human warships blocking every possible route forward. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. Morgan broadcast a simple choice. They could return to there and face judgment, or they could be destroyed in the void between stars. They debated for 6 hours. Some wanted to fight, knowing they would die. Others wanted to scatter and hope that some ships might escape. In the end, their survival instincts prevailed. They turned their exodus around and flew back to there, escorted by human warships that watched their every movement. They had already fallen. Their economy destroyed, their government collapsed. They had nothing left to resist with. Human administrators arrived to take control of their remaining infrastructure. The species that had traded in the deaths of billions found themselves reduced to laborers under human supervision. Only the remained defiant. High Chancellor asked every ship and soldier his species could muster for a final defensive there. He called upon the Dominion to honor the alliance that had been paid for with human blood. Surely they would not allow their coalition partners to be destroyed. But they refused to intervene. They had gained what they wanted from the original bargain. Human territory and human lives had satisfied their hunger for conquest. This new conflict between humans and their former allies was not their concern. They would watch from a safe distance and see which side emerged victorious. Oz faced the truth at last. He had sold humanity to buy peace for his people, and now that peace meant nothing. They would stand alone against an enemy they had created through their own treachery. Admiral Morgan's fleet arrived at Prime on a date chosen with deliberate symbolism. It was exactly 5 years since the day that Earth had burned. 5 years since billions of humans had died while their allies watched and did nothing. 5 years since the coalition had signed humanity's death warrant. The defensive fleet was large by any normal measure, but it was nothing compared to the force that had destroyed the Owl. Human ships surrounded the planet within hours, disabling defenses with methodical precision. Every orbital station was captured or destroyed. Every military vessel was eliminated. The lay exposed and helpless. But there was no bombardment. The weapons that had burned cities on worlds and shattered Owl fleets remained silent. Morgan had something different planned for the. She descended to the surface in a single shuttle, accompanied only by her personal guards. Her ship landed in the courtyard of the Coalition Council building, where Oz and the surviving leaders waited. They expected execution. They expected revenge to take the form of fire and death. Instead, Morgan walked into the council chambers alone. She stood before the alien leaders who had condemned her species to extinction, and she spoke to them in a voice that carried across every broadcast frequency in the system. She told them that they had believed humanity could be sacrificed for their comfort. She told them that they had believed their peace was worth the lives of billions. She told them that they had been wrong about everything. Then she presented a document. It was a new treaty, written in human terms and backed by the threat of total annihilation. The Galactic Seizure Accords demanded complete dissolution of the coalition. Every military asset would be surrendered to human oversight. Every former coalition territory would accept unrestricted human access, and every species that had signed humanity's death warrant would accept permanent placement of human observers. The galaxy would not be destroyed, it would be controlled. Oz read the document with trembling hands. He looked at Morgan and asked the question that every coalition leader wanted answered. He asked what would happen now. He asked if humanity intended to rule them forever. Morgan's response became the foundation of the new galactic order. She said that the coalition species would live under human watch until they proved they could be trusted with their own freedom. Given what they had done with that freedom 5 years ago, she expected the arrangement to last a very long time. The signed, they had no choice. The signed when their fleet was escorted back to there. The signed with their government in ruins. Even the signed their economy rebuilt under human supervision and their future entirely dependent on human permission. One by one, every species that had betrayed humanity submitted to the new order. Human ships took up permanent positions in orbit around every major world. Human observers took seats in every government chamber. Human laws replaced coalition regulations. The galaxy had believed itself civilized. It had believed that humanity was nothing more than useful savages who could be discarded when convenient. It had believed that treachery carried no lasting consequences. It had been wrong about all of it. Admiral Morgan retired 30 years after the seizure, passing command to the officers she had trained. She spent her final years on a world terraformed from the ashes of a former Al colony. From her home, she could see the memorial built to honor the billions who had died on Earth and Mars, and all the worlds that burned because their allies had sold them. When historians asked whether she regretted the harshness of human rule, her answer was always the same. She said that regret was for those who had choices. Humanity had been given extinction or vengeance. They had chosen survival. Let history judge whether they chose wisely. The Dominion eventually made the mistake of testing human resolve. They had consumed Earth with coalition blessing, and they believed that humans would forget this crime in time. They were wrong. When ships crossed into human-controlled space, the response was immediate and overwhelming. 7 worlds were reduced to rubble in 6 months. The Dominion sued for peace and accepted permanent restrictions on their military capacity. Humanity had entered the galactic stage as eager allies, desperate to belong. They had been welcomed, used, and discarded like broken tools, and they had returned as conquerors, bound by nothing but their own will. The galaxy, locked in the total seizure of human control, learned the lesson that should have been obvious from the start. Never betray a species that learned to survive by fighting itself for 10,000 years. Because if humans could do that to each other and still endure, there was no limit to what they would do to those who wronged them. For 1,000 years afterward, every species in known space woke each morning with a reminder of their mistake. Human ships patrolled their skis. Human observers watched their councils. Human law governed their actions, and the memory of what they had done to earn this fate never faded. The stars themselves seemed to remember what the coalition had tried to forget. Humanity had been betrayed, and the galaxy would never be allowed to make that mistake again.